Welcome to episode 4 of the In Between Classes podcast. I'm your host, Will Gottlieb, joined once again by my co-host and friend, Josh Schmidt. Josh, how's it going?
We're at that grind kind of midway into the year. It's this time of year where everyone's starting to wear out a little bit, so I'm excited for the podcast today because it's a little bit of motivation for me, I think. So should be fun.
Right, yeah. I'm feeling like it feels like once you get to middle of October, you're like, oh yeah, Thanksgiving's right around the corner. And you're like, oh wait, no, that's still a month away.
Yeah, the kids are definitely in the phrase of like, how many 5-day weeks do we have in a row?
Yep. I was just thinking that same thing. So, okay, so for today's podcast, something that we kind of wanted to talk about was the concept of covering material, or like, as Josh will explain it later, what he calls mastering material. In a classroom, should we be teaching so many units and just having the students have so that it's covered, or so that the students actually master the material? Then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about what we are to teach, and we're probably going to keep it mainly focused on a math curriculum. We might talk about some other type stuff, but probably stick mostly to math. Then at the end, I am going to kind of talk to Josh about an idea that I have for a classroom setup, and basically how I've described it is either it's kind of, I don't want to sound arrogant here, it's either kind of genius or completely stupid, and I just haven't figured out which one it is yet because I just really haven't seen people teaching this way. Maybe they are, but anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. So we'll get into our first topic, the idea of covering material or versus teaching material. So, Josh, like I said, you had an idea about the idea of mastering material before you move on, so I'll throw it to you. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think one of the big misnomers right away is the assumption is you have to choose one or the other, like cover an appropriate number of topics or have students who truly understand those topics. There are a small subset of kids who are going to cover all of the material in a grade level at grade level expectations or better. The problem is those students, like I talked about in our first episode, you can't really take credit for them. Like, they're going to survive on their own. So a lot of this conversation is boiling down to the students who are motivated but struggle, or the students who can do well and just aren't motivated. So, like Will talked about, do we want to focus on covering all of the grade level concepts at a shallow level, or is it more beneficial to cover less concepts but truly understand what you're covering? And for some of those students, you do have to make that choice. In my classroom, I do a mastery-based setup. So the goal would be that if a student is not motivated, they are going to leave my class knowing what they know. We're going to really hammer home these small subset of skills so that when they go to the next grade level, which for me is high school, they're going to at least have these small things mastered. I do that by making sure all assignments, I say they're not done till they're done. So if there's corrections, you have to make corrections, or it's a 0. If there's a quiz, you have to get 80% or better to move on. Or there's a quiz retake. Tests, you have to get 80% or better, or you have to do review standards on that skill. And everything tries to hit the philosophy of you are not ready to move on until you've actually mastered the material that you've seen. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it does fit the philosophy of I would rather have kids truly understand a concept rather than just have seen it a little bit.
Right, and this is as opposed to, I'm just picturing like the cliched view of high school where, a student, they have a big fat F on their paper, and then the next day they're going on learning new material. So they're not understanding material, but then on top of that, the teacher's moving on to new material. And, then you could say, hey, no, I taught my kids how to do X, Y, and Z, but if they came out and didn't understand it as by failing an assignment, did they master the material? Did you teach them material, or did you just cover the material? And so that's kind of what we're talking about in this aspect. So my question for you, Josh, is, so you do a mastery-based system in your classroom. Is that a kind of culture of the school? Are you the only one doing this, or like is a student in your classroom, okay, they know they have to master your material, but if they go to another classroom, it's like I said earlier, they fail something, they still move on? Like, is is this a classroom culture? Is this a school culture? How do you set that?
Well, I think that's a really good question because I've taught kind of in both settings. Back in South Dakota, where the school where Will went to high school, it was more of a traditional model, and so I did the mastery-based system there. But Will's right. The kids, what they did is they would internalize my structure pretty well, but it wasn't translating to success other places. So it really felt like the success was kind of pocketed. I now am able to teach in a school that fits my culture much, much better. The kids really are pushed mastery year after year, class after class. And although we have a lot of different models of that mastery, quiz retakes are the norm. They're not the exception, right? Like finishing an assignment to proficient level before that assignment is done is the norm. It's not the exception. And so you end up creating some new problems a little bit. You end up getting kids that, because the kids have been focused on mastery year after year, if I am a 7th grade math teacher, I cannot expect to teach 7th grade math to all of my kids. There are going to be students every year who know their content, but they are going to be behind grade level expectations. And so that's something you got to work on as well. But it definitely is more of a cultural aspect in the school that I'm in now, which fits my personality a lot better. It's easier to do it if other teachers have the same philosophy.
Right, I get that, and that idea of students coming in at different grade levels. I have don't let me forget. I had another thought that goes into my classroom setup that I want to mention earlier. So don't let me forget it.
Okay,
so
well
I want to mention that. But so then, where do I want to go next with this? So again, a student has to master material before they move on, and if a student isn't mastering something, they just sit there and go over it and over it again. So then I guess that's where the idea, where it feels like you can only have this idea in a self-paced classroom where, okay, Jimmy mastered the material in one day. You don't want to hold him back. He better get going. But Alex over there, he's struggling with this. He's going to need to take a few days before he gets to mastery. So to teach in a mastery setting, does it have to be a self-paced classroom like the one that you have set up, or is there options to do it in a somewhat traditional style?
I really believe that it is possible without doing a self-paced environment. I will say, though, it appears to be substantially easier. And I think a lot of good mastery-based classrooms are kind of a mixture of a bunch of things. I know that there are some English classrooms that I've seen that, because so many of those English skills are intermixed, it's not paced in the way that a math classroom is paced. You don't go from this skill to this skill to this skill. But if a kid is working on a paper, a teacher can focus on certain aspects of that assignment with this kid over here and this kid over here, and they can be different skills. I do think there does have to be some environment. Because like you said, Will, you get that test back, and it's 45% red ink right on the top. If you're the only kid in the classroom that didn't get a passing score on that test, I don't know how you can reteach that material to that kid in a reasonable setting without having some pacing going on. Because the reality is the kid who's getting the lowest proficiency score usually doesn't have a ton of motivation to go along with them as well. So you can't just say, come see me after school, come see me in the morning. That's probably why the kid's in that situation in the first place. They probably don't care as much.
Right, yeah, I get that. So then leading into that, so again, we have the idea of in a mastery setting, a self-paced setting, you're going to have some students who are way ahead, some students who are a little bit slower, take a little bit of time to understand stuff. So then by the end of the year, you get to, the end of May, suddenly you have some kid who was moving through material quicker. He's obviously going to cover more material than a slower student has. So that just kind of begs the question of our second topic of what do you teach? Like how do you as a teacher determine what you teach? Do you pull it straight out of a textbook like, okay, I have 13 chapters in this geometry textbook. I'm going to have all my students learn this material? Or I guess how do you justify like, okay, a faster student might get through all 13 chapters, a slower student might get through 10 chapters. How do you determine and justify what you teach in a classroom?
I think the three best places to start, I teach in a Common Core state. I used to teach in a Common Core state as well. That's probably the best place to start. The Common Core outline is actually really good for a brand new teacher trying to think of overarching ideas. There's a one-page document on the front of every grade level that says, you need to teach functions in 8th grade. Here are the skills under functions. You need to teach equations. Here are the skills under equations. You need to teach geometry. Here are the skills. And it's a nice short document. It ends up creating 12 to 15 generalized skills that you should teach in each grade level. It's a very easy place for a teacher to start. Another one is if your school has an existing program of studies, that's super helpful. In a lot of ways, what you need to know is not necessarily what the grade level expectations are. You need to know, what did the kids learn the last few years, and did they master that content? So if a kid is sent to you as a 7th grader and they've mastered every 7th grade standard, it doesn't matter what the 7th grade Common Core says at that point. You need to evolve. And then the other one is, honestly, finding teachers that you genuinely respect and just steal their content. The best teachers are the best thieves. So if there is somebody's content that you really respect and you think that they have some of this figured out, just take some of it. Just start using the ideas that they have, and then, you can kind of make your own flavor on it as you go. But it's one of the big reasons why I've tried to share my content for years. I don't want my content behind a paywall. I don't want to put it in a situation where people have to buy it, because I want somebody to be able to go to my website and just take the stuff that I use, so that if they're in that bind of, I don't know what to teach, they at least have something. I do say, after all that, though, a high-quality textbook absolutely has a place in a math classroom. It absolutely does. But I don't think right now starting with the textbook is probably the best place to begin, especially because if you're the teacher who starts on day one and hands out a textbook to all of your students, you lose a little bit of credibility with them. If you're the teacher who says the textbooks are over there and you're going to sign them out every couple of days, all of a sudden that little bit of difference, the kids are going to notice it real quick.
Say that one again. So the idea of, okay, you hand out textbooks, kids take it home. You say a teacher might lose credibility right away from that aspect. Why do you say that? Is that just a matter of the students like, the teacher doesn't know anything? They need the textbook as a guide?
No, I think it's a little bit of you. If you are, as a teacher, want to say that you're innovative, and then you hand out a textbook on day one, even if you are the most innovative teacher on the planet, the kids are going to see that textbook and they're going to make judgments about you. And we all know that kids, especially at that middle school and high school level, that first impression really matters. So as soon as you are the teacher that has the textbook on the side and there's something else, there's a choice board, there's a mechanic on a website, things like that, that little bit of difference piques their interest and you gain a little bit of credibility from it. I'm not saying that you can't teach incredibly effectively with a textbook, but if you hand out a textbook on day one, the kids are going to view you as a traditional style teacher. No matter what you are, that's the image that they're going to see.
So you're saying for that first impression idea, if you do, even if your plan is to just completely reinvent how you're teaching with this textbook, the idea is if you do the same thing every other teacher has done and hand out a textbook, they're going to view you the same way as every other teacher, regardless of what you do after that first step.
Exactly. So it's one of those things where, especially in middle school and high school, that first impression really matters, especially if you want to teach in a way that makes kids think differently than a traditional style. And so if you're going for a true mastery setup with some pacing elements, you want kids to think a little bit differently about their education. So you need to make sure you're setting that impression early that some things are going to be different in here. I think I say like 3 times a week to my kids that it is your job to know X, Y, and Z. A kid comes up to me today and they came in the morning and they wanted to work. I think that's great. But then they go, I don't know what I'm missing. And I look at him and go, I'll help you, but it is your job. Like, it is your job to know what skill you're working on, where you need to master that skill, and when it's due. I'll help you, but it is your job. And that's very different than environments where kids are given the assignment and then given a grade. I always use the term earn. Like, you earn a grade, right? Like, you put the corrections in and you earn the positive consequence. So if you want kids to think a little bit differently, you need to make sure you're setting the tone that that's what the expectation is.
Right, and that's where, don't start with the textbook. Right, don't start by handing out the textbook right away. Do something different and then ease it in. You're saying, okay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Couple more questions on this one, and I feel like I'm probably just going to keep being enamored here with the idea of a textbook, but I'm just throwing out there just because, I mean, that's how I was ever taught, and obviously I want to do things a little bit different, but at least for a first-time incoming teacher, as I will be a month from now, the idea of creating a curriculum from scratch, as you have done over 8-9 years of teaching, that's just obviously daunting and impossible. So I feel like at least my first point of entrance will be a textbook my first year. What are your thoughts? I've seen there's a textbook that I'm doing for my practicum that the teacher that I'm with my practicum in is using, and how it does it is it has, chapters 1 through 13 or whatever, but then at the beginning of each chapter it states like, hey, this section or this chapter is covering Common Core standards XYZ. So for me, it feels like that curriculum is set up where they're saying, okay, here are the skills we're going to teach you, and here's how Common Core comes into it, rather than where you suggested start with the Common Core and ease the skills into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually, I think one of the things that you do really, really well with how you think about content is you think about the textbook as a tool, not as the curriculum. There are so many schools across the United States that are like, oh, our math scores are poor, let's buy a new textbook and that will solve the problem. Whereas the truth is, the textbook, excuse me, is a very effective tool. And I think it's something that most good teachers have an element of in their classroom. I always want to have a textbook in my classroom. But the content is not the textbook in all situations. And so if you start with the skills, the standards, the expectations, the goals, and then you build content from there, maybe the textbook is the right resource for that skill, but it doesn't have to be in all situations.
Okay, yeah, I follow what you're saying there. So, again, it comes down to maybe it's more of a, and I've kind of said this forever. I mean, it doesn't matter what, like you said, some schools are saying, oh, we're bad at math, let's get a new math textbook. Like, I feel like the textbook is, like you said, it's a tool, and it's how the teacher uses the tool that determines how good it is. You can have an incredible teacher that will use it every now and then. You can have an incredible teacher that just lives by it as the Bible. But it's a matter of, if they're a great teacher, it doesn't matter how much of the textbook or how much of another curriculum they're going to use, the students are going to learn. So it still comes down to, like you said, it's a tool for the teacher to use.
And I also think it's something that's really important to understand that I really value the way that I teach, and I value the way that you think about education, but that is not necessarily inherently the best way. Like, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life. There are many great teachers out there who teach differently than I do and are just as, or if not more effective. I think that it's important for teachers to have a philosophy and a belief that they truly buy into, but it doesn't have to be the same as everybody else. I think that's something that's very hard. If someone walks into my classroom and really likes what I do, they immediately want to go, okay, so how do I go from here to where Schmidt is right now? Whereas the reality is I made some really important decisions about my philosophy and then got to the place that I am right now. And even though you and I have very similar feelings on education, I guarantee you our classrooms are going to look very different, but the goal is going to be the same.
Right. Another, just one last quick point while we're on the topic of what to teach. So I know that, like, in your classroom, well, I guess I don't know this for a fact, but I feel like you guys don't have a textbook that you're looking straight out of every single day, where when I look at your storyboards, your units online, it feels like you have built this curriculum from scratch out of nothing. Like, how was the best way to describe how you have built your curriculum?
So The textbooks are always a list of options. So what I did is I went, man, this is 7 years ago. I'm getting really old. I'm on the bad side of 30 now. I had 7 years ago, I went to the Common Core outline that I described. And the Common Core outline for each grade level, like I said, gives about 12 to 15 topics. I took those topics and I named them units or sections or whatever. And then from there, I created one video. I used IXL, so I found a couple IXLs for that topic. I found a textbook assignment for that topic. I found a couple games, and I just put them in a list, and then I kind of worked with the students on how best to work through that list. I started out at first with you just have to go from point A to B, and then I made kind of the order variable. But now the kids get a list of options, and then they pick their way through that list, and then I describe them as levels. So I have level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. I would theoretically like a student to work from level 1 to level 4 in every skill, but that's not reasonable. Some kids start higher. Some kids can't get to the level that I want them to. So I instead set a number of what I call boxes. You have to finish 4 boxes on this section minimum before you move on to the next section. And then you finish 3 boxes, and then you move on to the next section. I still do assessments very traditionally, though, because my kids are heading to high school, and I have not seen a high school that has a really flexible assessment structure. Most high schools have a very traditional assessment structure, and so even though my assignments may feel very differently, I want to make sure kids are assessed in a traditional way so that when they get to high school, they can handle a traditional quiz or a traditional test.
Okay, that makes sense. So in essence, your classroom, again, didn't just your curriculum, it hasn't popped up at, like, you started with the Common Core standards, then based on those standards, you found ways to teach and assess the kids on those standards rather than, having a textbook and saying, okay, we're going to start on chapter 1, then we're going to go to chapter 2, then we're going to blah, 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 and so on and so forth. It feels like over a span of 7 years, you have constructed a curriculum out of just these standards.
That would be the goal. And what's really interesting, I wish that teachers had the opportunity to do what I did, like just start from scratch. And the time restraint is a problem. Like, very few teachers have the time to be able to do that. But what I discovered was the order that I feel like is appropriate through content does not match what most textbooks feel. And it definitely didn't match what most online resources. And so it was really hard at first because there's this textbook that I really like that feels really differently. And then I did more research, and it turns out this textbook and this textbook and this online resource, they're all different. They all have different orders that they value. And so you kind of work through content in ways that make sense. Math builds from one skill to another. I like to start every year with some fraction understanding. Ratios, proportions, fraction computation, whatever it is. That's where I like to start because I feel like a good grounded understanding of those skills translates really well into other skills. A lot of textbooks start with decimals. And in my classroom, that doesn't make sense because I like going from fractions into decimal understanding. And so all of a sudden, where we started was a little bit different, and it kind of changes everything around your content. And as soon as you're in a school that's more flexible, all of a sudden, your kids are coming to you at different starting points. And all of a sudden, then the order's completely messed up. So it's really hard to... I think it's hard unless you have the opportunity to just really build a content yourself to understand what order you truly feel like is best.
Right, yeah, I get that. So now I want to move into our last topic of, okay, so this was just an idea I have for how I would assess a set of curriculums. And I created a visual online here that I shared with Josh. So our listening audience, this might be kind of difficult to follow, but hopefully we don't really care how the explanation of this goes. Hopefully we just get some good conversation about it afterwards. So again, Josh, so you're kind of looking at this Google document that I created. Essentially, there's the idea that, say you were a first-time teacher like myself, and you were just like, okay, instead of building something from scratch, I just want to use a textbook and try to teach very well using that textbook as a tool. So there's, say, 12 chapters in a year's worth of content. In a traditional setting, every student, whether they're an A student, an average BC student, or even a lower end D or F student, they are going to, what you could say, cover 12 chapters of material in a traditional classroom, because every day the teacher is teaching a different lesson on a different topic, and everybody's always together at the same time. What I see as a problem with that is you have your upper end students, your excelling students, they're going to understand it no matter what. It doesn't matter how you teach it. They're going to understand the material because that's just the kind of students they are. Then you have your average, your middle of the pack, your BC students. They're going to get through all 12 chapters with you, but they're not going to understand everything completely fully. They might understand it at BC level, 80 to 90% of every bit of the material. And then on the lower end, you're going to have your D or F students who they're going to get through all 12 chapters. They're going to cover all 12 chapters in a traditional setting, but no way they're mastering every bit of it. I mean, unfortunately, that's just how some students, they might not be able to comprehend it at the same speed as your upper end students, okay? So what happens then is you cover 12 chapters of material and you have students who, some of them might not master a single thing, but they're going to just cover a lot of things. So it's that idea of understanding an inch deep but a mile wide. You're seeing a bunch of material, but you're not understanding a lot of it. So then in my kind of idea of a self-paced classroom is you don't allow the students to move on until they meet a mastery level. And Josh, you've talked on this a lot as well. So now you have those upper echelon, your A students. They're, again, going to cover all 12 chapters. They're going to master every bit of it, again, just because that's the kind of students they are. But then you get your BC students who might be a little bit slower. So now in the year's worth of material, they might only cover 10 or 11 chapters of material. But now instead of only understanding everything at, an 80, 90% level, at BC level, now they understand 10 to 11 chapters of it at a mastered level. Then same goes with your DF students. They might get to chapter 8 or chapter 9 throughout the entire year, but now they've mastered 8 to 9 chapters worth of material. They might not touch on chapters 10, 11, and 12, but that they're coming out of the classroom mastering a set of material. So my thought is if you can set up a classroom like that, at least the students are mastering something. And, when they leave that math classroom, they're going to say, oh, yeah, I might not understand whatever chapter 12 was because I didn't get to it, but I can tell you exactly what this chapter was about because I mastered it. And so now why not just grade the students on the amount of material they covered rather than the depth of the entire curriculum? So that was kind of long-winded. Audience probably fell asleep. Josh, I don't know if you're asleep yet, maybe not. But what are your thoughts on that idea of just letting a student get as far as they want, but letting the students get as far as they can master and get graded on the amount of material rather than how well they understand it?
See, and I think this is the philosophical question that might be most important for teachers to truly value. And this is where I think it's very interesting for you, someone who's getting into the teaching profession, who's developing your own content. Would you rather have kids sent to you that had seen everything from the content that's up to grade level? So if an 8th grader sent to you, they've seen every single thing from K through 7, but they don't understand a majority of it? Or would you rather have kids that are sent to you that have not seen everything at grade level but truly understand what they've seen? So what about you, Will? If students are sent to your room, would you rather have them master the things that they've seen or have seen all of the things that they supposedly have mastered?
Right, yeah, and I'm obviously going to come off slightly biased here because I know which way this will come out sounding, but in the aspect, I would rather have the kids at least know the very basics of something, at least have something mastered. I have students coming into the geometry classroom I'm at, they just, every time they look at it, they have to go back to their notes to understand the distance formula, the Pythagorean theorem. And that tells me that, at the younger levels, yeah, they definitely touched on that stuff, but they didn't master it. And now they're in this sophomore class, and now they can't do the basics very well. how are they supposed to understand the upper level stuff? So in that aspect, yes, I would rather have students master something rather than seeing everything.
Well, and another question is, this is where I struggled. It felt like every single year I reviewed the same things. I cannot tell you how many teachers whine about, me included, having to reteach fractions every single year because the kids don't understand them. And then you basically get to an age, it's usually upper middle school, where you're just like, oh, we're out of time, we can no longer learn fractions. So kids sometimes saw them 3 or 4 consecutive years, never truly mastered them, and then just are done and just don't get to see them anymore. I think to myself,
clueless.
Yeah, and I think to myself, maybe it's impossible, but let's say you have kids who truly understood fractions. It took them longer, but they truly understood it. So I don't know if you necessarily have to think of it as they're always behind, because if you truly understand content, the review for the next year should be, in theory, shorter. And then the next year can be a little bit shorter as well. So eventually that you'll catch up. That's obviously it's not going to work perfectly that way, but that's the theory, that if you have more mastery, you have less review necessary every year.
Right. And then here's the other idea that I wanted to toss in there that I told you to remind me about, but the idea that now I bringing kids into my classroom the first day, and again, the self-paced style, in theory, I should have all the material set out, in a line ready for the students to tackle. My idea is, obviously some students are going to come in more advanced than other students. That's where the idea of just doing some pre-test come in. Like, oh, okay, at the beginning of chapter 1, they can do a pre-test. If they score X amount, just give them the actual test. If they pass the actual test, why have them go through all the material? Just send them on to chapter 2. Whereas then you'll have the lower end students come in that they'll take the pre-test, and obviously they aren't going to be ready to move on. So now you just have them go through the material as it would a normal student. So I like the idea of just having pre-tests as a way of, letting them be ready to take the actual test. If they can move right on from there. But that was just a little aside that I wanted to throw in there.
No, and I think that's really good. I actually I want to get your feeling on 2 big negatives with this system, things that I don't think you can get around. I want to get your thoughts on them. So the first one is, once kids start a pacing environment, it is really, really hard to go back to a non-pacing environment, especially if you let them finish at different levels. So with your idea, do you think you'd be able to do that idea if the next year they're going to a teacher who's going to start at chapter 1, every kid at the same level? So that's question 1. And then question 2 is, what do you think that you can do this long term without the culture of the school kind of matching what you do? So and so, like, if you have a kid sent to you, that is vastly below grade level, and then another kid is sent to you at vastly above grade level, and they're in the same classroom, do you feel like you can effectively do that without the entire school being on board? What do you think about those things?
I'll hit the first one. So again, the idea of can you do this self-paced classroom if you know the students are going into, a non-self-paced? And here it comes back to the idea of, if you're doing this and say some kids finish at chapter, in your class they finish at chapter 8, but they've mastered everything up to it, and some students have gotten through all of chapter 12 and they've mastered. Now you have 2 students going into the next grade level at 2 completely different areas. My thought is, now that traditional teacher, it should almost be easier for them, because, your upper echelon students, they're never going to have any problems with them. But now their lower echelon students, they will at least have that firm background that I'm convinced with a firm background, you can learn other stuff more. You can learn other stuff more easily. Whereas opposed, if they had just seen everything, that student seen everything but mastered nothing, that student is going to, again, struggle just the same way they would have struggled in the previous classroom. It's just like an unending cycle where if you have a student and you never make them master anything but just show them everything, they're going to struggle in your class, they're going to struggle in the next class, they're going to struggle in the class after that. But now if you require them to master something, that next class they're at least going to have a foundation, and at least for part of the year, they probably aren't going to completely struggle. That's my idea where, it almost should make it easier for that next teacher.
Well, and that's how I feel too. I think that the assumption is from a teacher that teaches in a traditional environment that this kid is going to do magically well, and then you gave me the kid and now they struggle. The reality is some kids are in a situation where they're going to struggle year after year after year. Maybe they're not motivated. They didn't get a firm background when they were younger. There could be a situation where they're just like, at home. How many kids at home are being told by their parents, like, I was bad at math when I was that age, so you can be mad at math now. There is a lot of factors that can make it super hard on a kid, no matter what you're going to do. But if you can give them a little bit, I like the way that you said, like, see everything but learn nothing or master nothing. I think that if we put kids in that situation, we're setting them up to fail. At least if they truly mastered this small subset of content, at least they're going to feel successful with that small subset.
Right, because then it's the idea that you're pushing the kid into the next grade level and you're telling the next teacher, like, hey, they're ready for whatever you want, even though, no, they're not. They didn't master it. Like, hey, this kid's seen everything from chapters 1 through 12 in my class. They should be ready for chapter 1 in your class. Like, no, like you said, that's setting them up to fail. That's misrepresenting that student's abilities, where at least now if you say, hey, this student's mastered chapters 1 through 8, he might struggle with stuff after that, but he is going to have a firm foundation there. So, and then what was that second question again?
So the question is basically like, do you feel like the culture in the school is necessary for the system to be successful?
That's kind of a tough one, just because I've never really experienced any other. I haven't experienced many different cultures in schools, so my idea.
Do you feel like you're going to look for a certain culture when you start applying for jobs? You think that's something that's going to matter to you, in the resume process?
In my thought, I am just more worried about whether my administration will back my ideas. If the teacher ahead of me and the teacher behind me and all the teachers around me don't do what I'm doing, I don't really care. But if I have support from my administration and they don't have a problem with me doing what I want to do, then yeah, that's more what I guess you could say that's the culture I'm looking for. Administration that will back the teachers up, is rather than a culture of self-paced or a culture of traditional. The culture I would look for is, because if I go into an interview and I present my idea to a superintendent that I'm interviewing with, and they're like, hey, yeah, that sounds great, I'm going to be excited to work for that guy. Where if I go in and present this idea and they're like, I don't know, we don't really do it that way around here, then I know if I got hired there and tried to do this, I would have zero support. And that's more the culture I'm looking for.
No, I think that sounds absolutely great. And understanding that before you start is really important. Because the truth is, shout out to Brad Seymour, none of this happens if Brad didn't let me be creative. Like, I always went to him and I said, hey, I have this idea. And he would be like, let's give it a shot. Let's see how it goes. And then if the idea completely flames out and is horrible, I would tell him, he goes, let's try the next one. Let's give it a shot and see how it goes.
And that's what I feel like you should be looking for as a teacher, an environment where you are supported by your administration, where you can be open to trying new ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'd like to go on to something I can't stop thinking about, but I feel like we filled up the conversation, filled up all of our time with that last conversation.
We'll have to tease it for the next one because it'll be perfect right before the election, too.
That it will be. So I'm not disappointed one bit that we're not going to get to that, not because of your idea, but just because we got so much other great content in. And like you said, we'll just push it back. So no big deal. So keeping that in mind, that will conclude today's episode. Josh, this was fun.
This was
excited
fun.
for the next time we do it, and have a good day.
Yeah, we'll see you in a couple weeks.